Um, Good evening, everyone. I'm Representative Harrison. Joining me tonight are Representative Labriola, Senator Berthel. We're very pleased and honored that Chairman Gillett has agreed to be with us tonight. She's going to give an overview of PURA and their role in electric rates. It's my pleasure to coordinate this event and to bring this information to you. Please type any questions that you may have in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and Chairman Gillett will be happy to address them at the conclusion of her presentation. And Representative Labriola or Senator Berthel, would you like to make any comments?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Representative Harrison. Thank you to Commissioner Gillett and for the agency for being here. And I think that this will be a nice, informative session for everyone who has joined us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Harrison. Thank you, Senator Berthel. And we're really very pleased to have Chairman Marissa Gillett here from PURA. She's going to have a great presentation. I hope everybody who's signed on tonight and is watching this will find it valuable and informative. So without further ado, let's go.
All right, thank you so much to the delegation for having me. I'm pleased to be here this evening along with a couple of my staff. So I have a PowerPoint presentation and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see this screen. Okay, so what I was hoping to cover tonight, I think it's a really important opportunity to introduce PURA to you, the constituents. I think PURA is one of the least understood and least utilized agency that we have in state government. And because of that, we really like to start out with a PURA 101 presentation about who we are and how we regulate and what we regulate. And most importantly, what we hope to accomplish through these presentations is explaining how you can engage with PURA on the matters that we do regulate. And by the end of the presentation, I'm hoping to have convinced you why it is so important to engage with PURA. I also have a couple of slides regarding utility rate making and specifically residential electric bills. I'm not going to be able to convey the entirety of how utility rates are set in this presentation, but hopefully you walk away with a little bit of the buzzwords at the very least, so you can continue digging in on this topic further. I also have a number of appendices, which I'm happy to reference and make these slides available too, if any of them end up piquing folks' interest during the Q&A portion. So how I like to start this presentation is by walking you through a little bit of PURA's mission statement. And this is derived from legislation and statutes primarily. PURA itself is a creature of statute. We have an agency in Connecticut that is, there are comparable agencies in every state across the country. They're sometimes referred to as public service commissions or public utility commissions. In Connecticut, we're called PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And all of these agencies across the country, they were created by legislatures with the purpose of regulating monopoly utilities. And specifically, we're here to regulate monopoly utilities that are investor owned. So what I mean by that are privately held utilities, most notably Eversource or United Illuminating, and their gas affiliates, and even some of their water affiliates. But we do not regulate the publicly held utilities. So if like in where I live, we're served by MDC Water, for example. They're publicly or municipally owned, so PURA does not have a role regulating those entities. So by statute, what our mission is, and this is by statute as well as US Supreme Court precedent, which I'll get into later in the presentation. In theory, we're supposed to be a balancing agency, balancing the rights of the utility and their shareholders with the rights of the individual. And for those of you that that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, which is probably most of you tonight. You may not know this about me, but I moved to this state 2.5 years ago for this job. And so I've spent, the past 2.5 years reflecting on how Connecticut approaches regulation versus how the state I came from approached regulation. I served at the Maryland Commission equivalent of PURA. And I have to say that I've expressed concerns with respect to how PURA historically has or has not been able to achieve that balance that's articulated here. And one of the outgrowths from that is doing presentations such as this to help explain how others can engage with us. So moving a little bit further into unpacking what we regulate, it's sometimes easier to explain what we don't regulate. And the ones at the top of this screen that are in bold yellow font are the ones that we most commonly get inquiries about that aren't in our jurisdiction. So unfortunately, and I do mean unfortunately, because we get this, sometimes in a month, 40% of our calls can be about the topic of internet or cable services. And that is not within PURA's jurisdiction. That is a deregulated market. Unfortunately, if you have issues with the price or the offer terms of like Comcast or Altice or whomever, that is not something that PURA directly regulates. We can, however, certainly assist you with getting in touch with a regulatory representative from those companies. So what you're probably interested in more than what we don't regulate is, of course, what we do regulate. So within those sectors of electric, natural gas, water, and some telecommunications, there's a lot that goes on in those fields beyond just the straight rate making that goes into it. For the electric sector, some of what you may interact with us on or hear about the utilities doing is their emergency response plans that are activated after a storm. There's issues, with their vegetation management, which is fancy word for tree trimming. We often press them on customer outreach and programs like that. Other things that we have oversight over include things that the legislature delegates to us. Because remember a moment ago, I was talking about PURA being a creature of statute. So that means quite simply that the legislature can tell us to do something. And that has often included delegating to us the design or administration or implementation of public policy programs, such as energy storage legislation from last session. Outside of the electric sector, when it comes to water companies, we have a lot of work in that space to do with replacing the aging infrastructure of the water companies. And also some of the smaller water companies in the state are continuing to kind of collapse into larger systems. So we have oversight over that, along with, we work with the Department of Public Health on those matters. And, the two screenshots here that are here, and the links are embedded within this presentation, and we'll be happy to make those available. I think we're probably most known, of course, for the rates that these companies are allowed to charge. And we've made these presentations that help walk through your electric bills and understanding the components of it, and which portions of the bill we do regulate. And I'm going to walk through that a little later in this presentation. Okay, so obviously I'm on this slide and talking to you tonight, but I actually have two colleagues. And this is one of the first differences about PURA compared to other state agencies that you may have interacted with. Excuse me, and that is that PURA is led by 3 commissioners, as opposed to a traditional agency having one secretary or commissioner or agency head. And the reason I like to point this out to people, as described on this slide, is it puts a fine point on how different PURA is from other agencies. And that difference is driven by the fact that we are a quasi-judicial agency. So what I mean by that is PURA is much more similar to a court than we are to a traditional agency. And this is important in explaining to you how to understand the actions PURA takes or how to engage with us. And so we're bound by any statutes that are passed. We also have the authority to issue our own regulations and ultimately our own decisions, which are legally binding in the same way that an opinion from a court could be legally binding. And they're legally binding on the entities that we regulate. So when PURA adopts a decision, it is legally binding on Eversource, for example, and can be appealed to Superior Court and up from there. You know, when I say that we're a court, you might wonder, well, okay, who are the parties that appear before you? And those are, of course, parties such as the utilities who are appearing before us to make an ask. You know, I'll use the example of a rate case. There are other parties that appear before us in those cases. There's a statutory party called the Office of Consumer Counsel, which is the ratepayer advocate and is charged with representing ratepayers in our proceedings. And I like to flag that because one of the most common misconceptions that we hear about PURA is, isn't PURA the customer watchdog? And unfortunately, that's not how PURA is statutorily designed. You can think of myself and my colleagues as judges, and we're charged with this balancing act that we talked about on the earlier slide. But there is a party that is statutorily charged with representing utility customers, and that's the Office of Consumer Counsel. There are also other parties that represent other interests in our proceedings, like there's the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and also the Attorney General's office often intervenes. And in addition to that, our proceedings are open and can be intervened into by other parties, including individual ratepayers. And I'm hoping to explain in a moment how you could go about doing that. Okay, let's get through this. So there's really a spectrum of ways to engage with PURA. And the reason that I want to focus on explaining this spectrum to you is because PURA, as a quasi-judicial agency, can only make decisions on the evidence that is put into the record in front of us. So if you think about a court and all the rules of evidence and everything that comes through it, whether you think of Law and Order or Perry Mason or something like that, we're not a criminal court, but we do resemble a lot of the features of a court proceeding that you may be used to. And that includes having parties who have an ask have to come before us and give us evidence that supports their position. And then the other parties in that proceeding can cross-examine them. There are, evidentiary hearings and legal briefs, and all of this culminates in an authority in a PURA decision. But what we've been lacking, in my opinion, and what we're really striving toward is that our decisions in the evidence that's put into these cases and put before us are not necessarily representative of a large swath or a broad set of perspectives. And so we're really really driving towards getting additional perspectives into these dockets. And making presentations to you all is hopefully one way to inspire engagement. There's different ways to do this. You can take a very passive approach of signing up for email alerts on the dockets that we have. I will say that PURA has an active docket caseload of around 100 dockets at a time. So this is certainly not something that you can, that we expect folks to be able to engage on 100, 100 dockets. But there are obviously some dockets that carry a heavier implications for your wallet than others. Stepping through up into a more active type of engagement with PURA can include providing comment on a matter at a public hearing. All of PURA's proceedings are open to the public. We have the ability to go into a confidential session, which we've only used twice in the 2.5 years I've been here, and I have a hearing almost every day. So I'd say 99% of the proceedings that we hold are open to the public. And since the pandemic's begun, we actually do all of our proceedings by Zoom, which means that you can dial in at any time and see what we're up to that day. If it's a matter that you can provide comments or evidence on, we open every hearing by extending an opportunity to members of the public to voice their comments or their feedback on the matter at hand. You can also submit your written comments or feedback on pending matters to us at any time by emailing those comments to the address on the screen. PURA gives equal weight to comments that are received verbally or in writing. So if your schedule doesn't permit it, or you otherwise don't want to attend the public hearing, please feel free to submit the comments in writing. I can guarantee that I read every last one of them. I'm going to show you, an indication of how we used public comments in just a moment. But that is something that we're really encouraging folks to do. Lastly, the most active way to engage in a PURA proceeding is to formally intervene as a party in the matter. And certainly this is not something that we expect folks to be able to do routinely. We, like a court, we have lawyers appearing before us, and it can be quite daunting. But we had some really great success, I think, a great success story with municipalities kind of joining together to retain counsel during our Tropical Storm Isaias investigation. And as a group, we're able to intervene and actually put on their first selectmen and select women as a witness panel during that docket. So I thought I'd stop by showing you an example of how powerful I think it can be to provide the public comments or intervene in the matter. And the best way I know how to do that is to show you this example from docket 200803, which was PURA's investigation into Eversource and United Illuminating's response to Tropical Storm Isaias. And I just have a few screenshots here. The docket, the decision itself was several hundred pages. So this is just a representative screenshot of what these decisions look like. They're decisions in the way that you might have seen a court opinion before. But some of the screenshots I have on the screen show you, what we do in these decisions when we get this public comment is we're able to summarize the comments that have been received and present them as evidence on which PURA can rely in making a decision. We also, like I mentioned a moment ago, had the pleasure of having some municipalities participate in this proceeding. And if you have the occasion to read this decision, it's quite lengthy. You'll see throughout that we relied on the public comment as well as the testimony from the municipalities to support what we ultimately did in that docket, which was levy the maximum civil penalty that we were allowed to under the law against Eversource for their conduct in that proceeding. And we relied heavily on the public comment and experience of the municipalities. So that was a $28.4 million fine. And I can say without a doubt that we would not have been able to reach that conclusion without the evidence that was provided from individuals in the municipalities. So The next part of this presentation is I wanted to introduce you a little bit to utility rate making, and then talk to you a little bit about how to understand your electric bills. Because now that I've hopefully introduced you a little bit to PURA, as well as how to engage with us, there will be rate cases coming up for utilities in the next couple of years. And that could be an opportunity for you to provide feedback and comments or testimony on those requests. And to do that, I wanted to start by explaining a little bit about how utility rates are set. Because I know before I got into this field, I'm sure if someone had asked me how my Eversource bill was made, or when I lived in Maryland, it was obviously a different utility, I would have just said, I don't know, they asked for, they think they can charge X dollars and that's what they charge. And the answer here is it's actually quite complicated. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about doing outreach like this is I think it's actually been complicated unnecessarily. And when it's difficult for folks to unpack, it's easy for people in positions of power to, dismiss your concerns as, this is a wonky, too in the weeds subject matter. So I am going to give it my best attempt to explain how the components that go into these utility rates. So the first or the end result of a utility rate case is that you're looking through this rate case to develop what's called a revenue requirement. And in its simplest form, this is a pot of money that the utility is being authorized to collect by the regulator. It's made up of all of its parts and components, whether these are expenses such as taxes or depreciation, or depreciation of those assets. It also incorporates the value of those assets that they own. So like the poles and wires, for example. And what's baked into that equation as well is a rate of return. So this is the profit that the utilities have the opportunity to earn, which is authorized through the rate cases. And I get this question a lot about profit margin and things like that, or even taking a step backwards and saying, well, why does PURA regulate the utilities whatsoever? And why do you allow the utility to be a monopoly? And there's a lot that goes into those various questions. But one of the reasons we are here to regulate is for this question of the rate of return and setting the allowed profit of these utilities. Because they're monopolies, there is no market force that is determining that profit margin for them. So it is determined through a rate case. And specifically what's determined is the amount of the rate of return that they should have the opportunity to earn. And that factors into this equation, and you come up with a revenue requirement, which is, again, just that bucket of money that utilities are being authorized to collect through rates. So what happens after we determine the revenue requirement? After we've gone through all the numbers and figured out what the utility should be allowed to collect and why, we then have to turn that revenue requirement into rates. And this is where, when you start to look at your bill and you wonder why there are multiple line items that might say distribution rate, and there's a fixed charge, and then there's a charge that has, it multiplied against something. Those are the components of your rate design. And what we're doing is trying to figure out how the utility is going to recoup its revenue requirement through those specific components of both a mixture of fixed charges and what are called volumetric charges. And volumetric charges are the charges, there's a lot of them on your bill, where it's a rate multiplied by your usage that month. So I'm gonna kind of walk through this. I do want to flag, the question that we get is, but why are you allowing the utility to earn a profit? Why should they be earning a profit at all on an essential public service? And the answer is rooted in pretty lengthy Supreme Court precedent, and it's U.S. Supreme Court precedent. This dates back over a century, and it gets into what's known as the regulatory compact. And this is where we can unpack the question about utilities that are monopolies, and why are they allowed to be a monopoly, and why are they allowed to earn a profit as a monopoly. And if you rewind about 100 years to when the economy was first becoming electrified and having access to electric utilities, there used to be multiple wires or poles up around the urban centers, and it quickly became apparent to folks that wasn't going to be a sustainable model, both because of blight issues, or also primarily because of cost. It's just not it is cost prohibitive to have multiple sets of poles and wires. So it was determined that electric utilities and natural gas utilities and water utilities, you can only have one set of distribution infrastructure in a specific geographic footprint. It's a natural monopoly is what they're referred to. And so, folks set about trying to figure out, well, how do you deal with a monopoly where they have, by definition, kind of a stranglehold on those services, and how are you going to control the rates that they charge from them? And that's where entities like PURA and our siblings across the country came up. And through some precedent that went to the Supreme Court, they set out some guiding principles about how the utility should be allowed to recover. And one of those is that utilities must be offered recovery of the monies that they're putting into this infrastructure, as well as a reasonable opportunity to earn a return on those profits. So, so there is way too much text on this slide, but again, I'm going to make these available to folks. So now that I've given you a crash course in utility rate making, you're probably sitting there wondering, well, what does that mean to me and my my bills, and specifically my Eversource bills, where I'm seeing a delivery charge that is 3 times what my supply rate is. Right, that's like the number one question that I'd say I get day in and day out is, why is my delivery charge 3 times that of my supply charge? And the answer is quite simply that it's not 3 times that of the supply. Now, hear me out. Your delivery portion of your bill is really a misnomer, and it's something that I identified shortly after I came here. And we're working on remediating, but the delivery portion of your bill has really become a misnomer. What's in the delivery portion of your bill is much more than just the cost of the poles and wires outside of your house or your distribution rates. When I hear the word delivery, I'm thinking to myself, well, that must mean, I've got my supply, which is the commodity, the electrons running through the wires, the fuel, if you will. And then I've got the delivery portion of my bill, which means the cost of what it costs to deliver that fuel. And that's true in part, but what's been lumped into those portions of your bill are other expenses beyond just what we think of, which is really the distribution charges. In addition to distribution charges, there are what are called transmission charges in your delivery fee. The simplest way I can think of to describe this is if you analogize it to the highway system or the roadway system in this country. In highways, you can think of as the transmission lines. So the transmission lines are, getting the energy across long distances at high speeds, high voltages. And then you can step that down into the distribution network, which is like the roads, that you're traveling on within your communities. And those are the poles and wires that PURA regulates. So it costs an increasing amount of money, increasingly high percentage of your bill is going to transmission rates, which are actually regulated by the federal government. An additional portion of your bill, which is sizable, is your public policy costs. So that can average between 20% of your bill. Public policy costs are, what you hear or what it sounds like. These are costs that are, almost exclusively legislated, and they go to things like, power purchase agreements to support renewable or clean generation. They go to things such as supporting Operation Fuel or programs that help with energy assistance. So that's a sizable portion of your bill. So when you're looking at your delivery portion of your bill, it's not just the true distribution of that electricity that it's capturing. It's capturing a lot more than that. So to an illustration of what I just walked you through, and hopefully you can see on the screen, this probably looks like what you're used to seeing. I don't know why this picture actually has the inverse of the supply and delivery. I know that is not folks' experience, but that's what you're probably used to seeing. When you turn to the line items of your bill, this is a representation of what I just walked you through. The generation service charge, this is the supply rate. This is what you're probably familiar with having spiked dramatically in your bill this past month. The supply rate is deregulated. So PURA does not regulate this charge. And it is not actually a moneymaker for the utilities either. It is we're procuring the supply from the competitive regional market. And PURA does oversee the procurement of that supply to make sure that it is done competitively and that the cheapest energy is purchased. But we're not regulating it in the sense that we're able to set the price for it. So, when I see folks, the rate always goes up on January 1 and it always goes down on July 1. And that's because our region is primarily served by generation that is made from natural gas. And natural gas is always more expensive in the winter months, the January to June 30th period, and it's always cheaper to generate electricity in this region in the second half of the year. So unfortunately, we, as were our neighbors, were impacted by the natural gas price spikes that the rest of the country and really the world were affected by. So you probably saw your supply spike in January along with everyone else. On the delivery portion of your bill, again, this is just illustrative of what I walked through a moment ago. And this shows you how those charges can be grouped. You got your transmission, and everything in green here is more appropriately characterized as a distribution rate. And those are what are directly regulated by PURA through a traditional rate case. So the last thing I want to end on, because I want to leave a healthy amount of time for questions here, is just this information which I'm showing on the screen now. PURA we're a small but mighty agency. I have about 80 people on staff to regulate quite a lot, of the public essential goods that everyone relies on every day. Small portion of that staff are dedicated to, a consumer services center where we take phone calls from customers every day. If you need help, contacting a utility or getting in touch with your utility, you need help, understanding your bill or entering into a payment arrangement, or you want to register a complaint against the utility or a third-party supplier, or you just have a question, that's what we are available for through the numbers that are on the screen now. We can be contacted at this phone number during business hours, Monday through Friday, 8:35. You can also email us at the address here on the screen, or you can file a complaint, through this form that's accessible on our website. We really look forward to hearing from you and providing assistance where we can. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen to make sure that we are available for questions. So thank you so much. I'm happy to go back through any of those slides as helpful and here to answer any questions that you have.
So I'll start if you don't mind. Does PURA have any legislation in mind for the legislative session?
Oh, so about 18 months ago now, the legislature passed the Take Back Our Grid Act, which gave PURA a lot of work to do. So we are not anxious to bite off any more than we can chew at the moment. There were some really great accountability measures that were in that bipartisan piece of legislation that we're still working through. The legislation that we're looking for this session as a short session is going to be some legislation around natural gas pipeline safety provisions to make sure that we can retain our jurisdiction over that, because otherwise the federal government will take it away. So we have some safety enhancements that we're hoping to accomplish. Besides that, we are always supportive of efforts that will help us with my mission of increasingly holding the utilities that we regulate accountable, as well as the stakeholders that we interact with. And besides that, we don't typically take policy positions. I view our role as trying to implement the policy that's given to us by the legislature in the most cost-effective way that we can. So you won't see us actively taking, asking for legislation on policy pieces. But I think I just answered more than you asked me. So happy to follow up.
Hi, Marissa, Jim Britton from the town of Washington. You may have mentioned this, but did you state that you would be able to send those slides out to us as a point of reference?
Absolutely. And the slides have links embedded in them, which would obviously be more helpful if you have them. So I believe we're recording this, so I can make the recording and the slides available through your delegation.
That's great. Thank you.
I think I have one more question, if you don't mind, and that was from your conversation. And I know everyone was, and I'll probably never say the name of that storm correctly, ISIS, but there was a fine levied, and I think that was certainly appropriate for what happened. But what happens with that fine? If you could maybe describe to the people here what's going to happen with that, and also concerns, would that ever be allowed to be passed into the back to the ratepayers? So why don't we talk about that? Thank you.
Yes, I'd be happy to. So As I mentioned, the fine was the maximum civil penalty that was available at the time. One thing that the Take Back Our Grid Act did was it increased the amount of the fine that we could levy. So if, and I really hope this doesn't happen, but if there was a repeat, we would be able to issue a more significant fine. That $28.4 million, which equates to 1.5% of Eversource's annual distribution revenues. That's how that's calculated. That PURA ordered to be distributed through a bill credit. So that started being distributed last August, and the bill credits happen over the course of a year, and they're determined volumetrically, so based on your usage. Now, you know, $28.4 million sounds like a lot, and we certainly hope it was enough to send some signals to the utility that we were hoping to hold accountable, but it's really not when you talk about the fact that there are over 1 million ratepayers. So, you know, when you take, even if I did really rough math here and said $28 per person, assuming everyone used the same amount of electricity, $28 over the course of a year, you're probably seeing, you know, $1 or $2 in terms of a credit on your bill. And if you look at your bill, you should see a line item that says TS penalty. And so that should be returned on customers' bills through July. Now, you know, the question of whether that can be recovered in rates, the legislation, both the Take Back Our Grid Act and its predecessor, explicitly prohibit any fines, not just this one, but any fines PURA levies. And unfortunately, I've been issuing quite a number of fines. Like Eversource got a $2 million fine in the fall for some of its natural gas marketing, for example. Any fine that I levy is explicitly prohibited to be recovered in rates. Now, I know, you know, there are a lot of folks out there with a healthy amount of skepticism who think, well, okay, maybe they're not going to explicitly bake in that $28.4 million into their next rate case, but they're going to get it somewhere else. And I appreciate that skepticism. Like I said, I think it's healthy. And that is why we need all eyes and participation on these rate cases, because they're coming into us with literally $1 billion, you know, in requests. And one of the most impactful things from the Take Back Our Grid Act was that that legislation increased the amount of time PURA has to conduct a rate case. We used to be in the bottom 9% of the country, and not in a good way, like in terms of the amount of time PURA had to make a decision. It used to be less than half a year. That legislation doubled that amount of time. So now that PURA has almost a year, 360 days to conduct a rate case. So that's more time for us to go through their line item requests that, you know, essentially make up this big revenue requirement. And it's more time for our stakeholders and for individual ratepayers to look through their materials, because all of this is public. So I don't know if there's anyone out there who was an accountant or an actuary. Like, there's a lot of overlap with the insurance world. But if you're looking for a hobby and you want to, you know, join the citizen ranks during the next rate case, we are really, you know, excited about the length of time that we have to look at these rate cases. And I think it's incumbent on me, my colleagues, and all of our stakeholders to make sure that that money really isn't collected through some other line item, because it's not supposed to be. So I hope that was responsive. I'm clearly passionate about a topic that I could go on about, but I'm happy to address other questions.
No, thank you for that. I think I'm done with questions. I don't know, Representative Labriola, if he may have some, or any other people on the call.
I have a question. I have a question about the matter of when there are appearances before the Regulatory Commission from the utility that do not provide adequate information according to the assertion of the utility. And it comes back later to the Regulatory Commission saying, oh, we didn't show you this and that overhead or this and that cost to us. And they come and they ask for more revenue allowance than they were given with the first judgment. And I know this has happened with the water company, as you are probably familiar. And I am wondering why inadequate provision of data is allowed to be an excuse for an adjustment of greater value allowed to the utility company. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm probably not going to make you feel better with this answer, because if I know what you're referring to, it's a case on which I dissented. So I did not agree with my colleagues in that.
I congratulate you on your dissent.
Yeah, I wish I had carried the majority in that. But the question is, so all of our decisions must be based on substantial evidence. And the statutes that we're bound by when we're evaluating, rate cases and requests to increase rates, the standard is supposed to have the burden of proof on the party that's asking for it. And that, that's almost always going to be the utility who's asking for a rate increase, which means that they are supposed to bear that burden. And when our decisions are, appealed to Superior Court, we are supposed to receive deference as the administrative agency with the expertise, so long as our decisions were based on what's called substantial evidence, and so long as we did not make an error of fact or law. And so I have to say, I agree with you, and my dissent on that Connecticut water case, I think it lays out why I agree with you. So like I said, I'm not going to make you feel better, because I agree with you. So
do I understand, in other words, that the final decision would have been a vote among the three of you, and if the majority decided in one direction, that would be how the decision would be adjusted?
That's correct. So
thank you.
Decisions are a vote of the three.
Thank you for your answer, my dear.
Most welcome.
Marissa, I want to thank you for being so informative and articulate, and you really know your subject, that's for sure. We want to thank you for your time. We're going to keep a lookout for legislation involving continued regulation of safety regarding gas lines. That's an important topic. So I just want to, on behalf of everybody, I want to thank you. I guess we'll open it up again to see if there's any other questions, but we're so very grateful for you getting us your time tonight.
Most welcome. And, now that I have a chance to reflect, I do want to flag one upcoming docket that may be of particular interest. And that's another docket coming out of the Take Back Our Grid Act, which empowered PURA to pursue a number of specific remedies for rates. One of those was a interim rate decrease, which we have completed for both Eversource and UI. And another item was to create a discount rate for folks that are of low income or fixed income. So we are proceeding into that docket currently. We're hoping to reach a decision this year. So that's something that I'd like to flag to folks that, and I'll ramble off the docket number now, and then hopefully you can refer back to the recording. The reason the docket number is important is it allows you to track our actions through our website. And also, if you provide comments, you can reference the docket number in your comments. So the docket number is 17-12-03 RE11. So I will also put it into the chat, but that is one docket to watch for the rest of the year. That is of interest to folks. And again, that's another thing that the Take Back Our Grid Act empowered us to do. So circling back to Representative Harrison's question, I'm really intent on wielding all the different tools and accountability measures that legislation gave us before I come back and ask you all for more. Although there is much more to do. So I'm looking forward to engaging with the legislature this session and next session. But not sure if I've inspired any more questions.
Looks like not. So I'm gonna say the same thing. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. I hope they found that this was informative, and your knowledge of PURA and being able to share it with us tonight. We can't thank you enough for that and taking your time out to graciously do this for us. So thank you.
Absolutely. And apologies for the interruption of a half-naked child halfway through that presentation. So I'm going to go figure out what's going on there. But I thank everyone for your attention, and thank you so much for being with us. And I'm happy to come back if there's something else I can follow up on. So thank you again. And I guess this is good night.
Thank you.